A lawyer is hired to manage the estate of a wealthy philanthropist. The will mentions a secret heir who must be found before the other heirs know. The mysterious heir could reveal the philanthropist's dark past for the others. The large mahogany table in the center of the room seemed to absorb the dim light, filtering through the heavy drapes, casting the space in a perpetual twilight. Jane adjusted her posture in the high-backed leather chair, her fingers tracing the embossed pattern on the armrest, trying to quell the unease that had settled in her chest since she had walked into this room. The walls, lined with shelves of dusty legal tomes, seemed to close in as the lawyer, a grey-haired man named Whitman, cleared his throat and began to read the contents of Mr. Roberts' will. Mr. Roberts was a man of considerable means, Whitman began, his voice carrying the weight of years spent delivering such news. He was also a man of secrets. Jane's interest piqued at this. She had been handling estates for years, but there was something about this case, about Mr. Roberts, that felt different. She hadn't known him personally, but his reputation as a philanthropist had reached far and wide. Yet here she was, sitting in a room that felt more like a crypt, waiting to uncover what exactly this man had left behind. Whitman continued, his words measured and precise. The bulk of the estate, as expected, was to be divided among various charities and foundations that Mr. Roberts had supported throughout his life. However, it was the final clause that sent a ripple of unease through the room. "There is one more matter to address," Whitman said, his eyes lifting from the paper to meet Jane's. "Mr. Roberts has left instructions regarding an heir, a secret heir, whose identity is known only to him. It is your responsibility, Miss Donovan, to find this heir and ensure that their inheritance is delivered." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. A secret heir. Jane's mind raced with questions. Why had Mr. Roberts kept this person hidden, and why had he chosen her, of all people, to find them? As the meeting concluded, Jane gathered the documents and rose from her chair. Whitman offered her a curt nod, but his eyes lingered on her, as if trying to gauge her reaction. She forced a polite smile and exited the room, her thoughts already spiraling into the possibilities of what this new task might uncover. The mansion's grand foyer greeted her with its cold, polished floors and silent echoes. She paused at the entrance, looking back at the closed door behind her. Somewhere within this estate, or perhaps beyond it, lay the key to Mr. Roberts's final secret, a secret that was now her responsibility to unravel. As Jane stepped out into the grey afternoon, the weight of her new task pressed down on her, mingling with the autumn chill. She had no idea where this path would lead, but she knew one thing for certain. It was not going to be a straightforward journey. The mansion loomed ahead, its towering facade dark against the overcast sky. Jane's footsteps echoed off the stone steps as she approached the grand entrance, the doors groaning open with a creak that sent a shiver down her spine. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged wood and something faintly metallic. The hallway stretched before her, dimly lit by a few sconces that flickered weakly, as if struggling to push back the encroaching shadows. Jane's eyes were immediately drawn to the details. The ornate carvings in the woodwork, the intricate patterns in the marble floor, and the grand staircase that spiraled upward into darkness. The mansion was a relic of another time, preserved with meticulous care, yet it felt as though it had been abandoned for years. Every corner seemed to hold a memory, every shadow a secret waiting to be uncovered. Her heels clicked softly as she moved deeper into the mansion, her senses heightened by the oppressive silence. She paused in front of a large portrait of Mr. Roberts, his stern gaze following her as she moved. He had been a man of formidable presence in life, and it seemed that even in death, his influence lingered in the very walls of his home. As Jane wandered the hallways, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The mansion, with its labyrinth of rooms and corridors, was both a sanctuary and a prison, holding within it the echoes of a past that refused to stay buried. She reached a set of double doors at the end of a narrow corridor, their brass handles cold under her touch. With a deep breath, she pushed them open, revealing a large study, the heart of the mansion. The room was dominated by a massive desk, cluttered with papers, and shelves lined with leather-bound volumes. A fireplace crackled weakly in the corner, its warmth failing to chase away the chill that seemed to seep from the very walls. Jane moved to the desk, her fingers brushing over the stacks of papers, old letters, and journals. It was here that Mr. Roberts had spent his final days, surrounded by his thoughts, his secrets. She pulled out the chair and sat down, feeling the weight of her task settle more heavily on her shoulders. As she began to sift through the papers, a small, leather-bound notebook caught her eye. It was worn, the pages yellowed with age, and a ribbon marked a page near the middle. Jane carefully opened it, her eyes scanning the handwritten notes. They were cryptic, filled with names and dates, but one entry stood out: "The heir must be found, the truth must not be lost." The words sent a chill down her spine. Whatever Mr. Roberts had been hiding, it was clear that it was something far more complex and dangerous than she had anticipated. Jane closed the notebook, her mind racing with possibilities. The mansion, with all its grandeur and mystery, was just the beginning. There was so much more to uncover, and she was only just starting to scratch the surface. The following morning, Jane found herself seated at a dusty desk in the town's records office. The room was a far cry from the opulence of Mr. Roberts' mansion, a cramped space lined with metal filing cabinets and cluttered with stacks of yellowing documents. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the room. Jane adjusted her glasses and flipped through the thick ledger in front of her, scanning for any mention of the adoptions linked to Mr. Roberts. She had already spent hours sifting through the records, and the tedium was beginning to wear on her. But Jane was nothing if not thorough, and she knew that the key to finding the secret heir might be buried somewhere in these pages. Her finger paused as she came across a familiar name: Roberts Theodore. The entry was brief, merely noting his role as the adoptive father in a series of adoptions that had taken place over the past 2 decades. Each record was marked with a name, a date, and the word "finalized," but there were no further details, no birth certificates, no backgrounds on the children, just a trail of names that led nowhere. Jane frowned. It was unusual for adoption records to be this sparse, especially in a town as small as this. Something about it didn't sit right with her. She jotted down the names in her notebook, feeling the frustration build as she realized how little information she actually had. Her thoughts were interrupted by the creak of the office door. A middle-aged woman with a tired expression shuffled in, glancing curiously at Jane before settling behind the counter. Jane decided to take a chance. "Excuse me," she said, approaching the woman. "I'm looking into some adoption records linked to Mr. Roberts. I noticed that the details are a bit incomplete. Is there any additional information that might be kept somewhere else?" The woman blinked, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Incomplete? That's strange. Let me see." Jane handed over the ledger, watching as the woman's frown deepened. After a moment, she shook her head. "This is all we have on file. If there's anything missing, it would have to be in the private records, but those are sealed." "Sealed?" Jane echoed, her curiosity piqued. "Why would they be sealed?" The woman hesitated, glancing around as if to ensure they were alone. "Mr. Roberts had a lot of influence in this town," she said quietly. "He could have had the record sealed for any number of reasons. It's not something we would question, especially not someone like him." Jane nodded slowly, absorbing this information. It was becoming increasingly clear that Mr. Roberts had gone to great lengths to keep certain things hidden, but the more barriers she encountered, the more determined she became to uncover the truth. "Thank you," Jane said, forcing a polite smile as she took back the ledger. She returned to her seat, the woman's words echoing in her mind. Sealed records, missing information. It was as if someone had deliberately erased the trail she was trying to follow. But Jane was not easily deterred. She had a list of names, and it was a start. She would have to dig deeper, but she knew that somewhere out there was the secret heir waiting to be found. The drive to the orphanage took Jane through the outskirts of town, where the narrow roads wound through dense forests and open fields. The morning mist clung to the trees, giving the landscape an eerie, otherworldly quality. As she navigated the winding road, Jane couldn't shake the feeling that she was heading into the unknown, into a place that held answers, but also more questions. The orphanage itself was a stark, imposing building, its grey stone walls rising sharply against the muted sky. It looked more like an institution than a place of care, with its tall, narrow windows and the high fence that surrounded the property. Jane parked her car outside the gates, taking a moment to gather her thoughts before stepping out. As she approached the entrance, she was greeted by the sight of children playing in the courtyard, though their laughter was oddly subdued, as if dampened by the weight of the building that loomed over them. A woman in her late 50s, dressed in a conservative navy suit, appeared in the doorway, her sharp eyes assessing Jane with a practiced smile. "You must be Miss Donovan," the woman said, extending a hand. "I'm Mrs. Whelan, the director of this orphanage. I understand you're here on behalf of Mr. Roberts's estate." Jane shook her hand, noting the firmness of her grip. "Yes, thank you for meeting with me, Mrs. Whelan. I'm looking into some of the adoptions that Mr. Roberts facilitated over the years." Mrs. Whelan's smile didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that Jane couldn't quite place. Of course, Mr. Roberts was a great benefactor of this orphanage. His generosity provided many children with opportunities they might never have had otherwise. As she led Jane into her office, the director spoke at length about Mr. Roberts' contributions, painting a picture of a man who had devoted much of his life to helping those in need. The office was neat and orderly, with framed photographs of smiling children on the walls and a large desk that dominated the room. Jane listened politely, but her mind was elsewhere, trying to gauge the director's sincerity. There was something about the way Mrs. Whelan spoke, so rehearsed, so carefully measured, that made Jane uneasy. When they finally sat down, Jane decided to get straight to the point. "I've noticed some discrepancies in the adoption records linked to Mr. Roberts," she began. "There seems to be very little information available on the children he adopted. Do you have any records here that might fill in the gaps?" Mrs. Whelan's smile faded slightly, her expression becoming more guarded. "I'm afraid all the records we have are kept strictly confidential, in accordance with state law," she said. "I can assure you that everything was done legally and with the best interests of the children in mind." Jane nodded, but she didn't believe the director's assurances for a second. There was something hidden beneath the surface, something Mrs. Whelan wasn't telling her, but pushing too hard now could jeopardize her investigation. "I understand," Jane replied, keeping her tone neutral. "I appreciate your time, Mrs. Whelan. If anything else comes up, I'll be sure to let you know." As she left the orphanage, Jane couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking away with more questions than answers. Mrs. Whelan had been helpful, but only on the surface. Beneath the polite words and the well-practiced smiles, there was a secret waiting to be uncovered, a secret that Jane was determined to bring to light. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the horizon as Jane parked her car in front of the local library. The building, much like the rest of the town, had a certain old-world charm, with its red brick exterior and ivy-covered walls. Inside, however, the atmosphere was subdued, almost somber, as if the walls held secrets of their own. Jane greeted the librarian, a soft-spoken woman with greying hair, and made her way to the archives section. She had spent the last few hours following up on the names she had found in the adoption records, hoping to find any trace of the children who had passed through Mr. Roberts' hands. But so far, her search had yielded little more than frustration. She settled into one of the study carrels, her notebook open beside her as she pored over old newspaper clippings and town records. Each article she found seemed to tell the same story. Children adopted by Mr. Roberts had seemingly vanished without a trace. There were no reports of them after the adoptions were finalized, no school records, no mentions in the town's social pages. It was as if they had simply disappeared. Jane's frustration deepened as she realized how neatly these children had been erased from the town's history. She found one article from nearly 10 years ago, a brief mention of a boy named David who had been adopted by Mr. Roberts. The article described David as a bright, cheerful child, well-liked by the other orphans, but after the adoption, there was nothing. No follow-up, no photographs, no mention of what had become of him. The pattern repeated itself with each name she searched. The children were adopted, and then they were gone, swallowed by the shadows of Mr. Roberts' philanthropy. Jane couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. It was as if Mr. Roberts had carefully constructed a facade of benevolence, hiding something far darker beneath. She scribbled notes furiously, her mind racing to piece together the fragments of information she had uncovered. But the more she dug, the more questions arose. Why had these children been adopted only to disappear? And what was the connection between these disappearances and the secret heir mentioned in the will? As she reached for another folder, the librarian appeared at her side, placing a stack of old newspapers on the desk. "I found these in the back," she said softly. "They might be of interest." Jane offered a grateful smile and began flipping through the pages. Her breath caught when she saw a small, grainy photograph of a young girl. The caption read, "Eliza, adopted by Mr. Theodore Roberts, 2007. The article was brief, celebrating the adoption of Eliza, described as a quiet, thoughtful child, but like the others, her trail ended there. Jane studied the photograph, the girl's sad eyes staring back at her from the past. She couldn't help but wonder what had happened to Eliza and the others. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that these disappearances were no accident. There was something far more sinister at play, something that Mr. Roberts had gone to great lengths to conceal. With a heavy heart, Jane closed the folder and gathered her notes. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but there were still too many gaps. She knew she had to dig deeper to find the connections that would reveal the truth. But as she left the library, one thing was clear. Whatever Mr. Roberts had been involved in, it was far from the benevolent image he had presented to the world. The next day, Jane returned to the orphanage, determined to dig deeper into the mystery of the vanished children. She had spent the night going over her notes, formulating a plan to get the information she needed. But as she walked through the orphanage gates, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in her chest. The building's cold stone facade seemed even more foreboding in the harsh morning light. Jane had arranged to speak with several of the orphanage staff, hoping that someone might let something slip, intentionally or not. Mrs. Whelan had agreed to the interviews, albeit with a slightly strained smile that did little to hide her apprehension. The first staff member Jane spoke with was a young woman named Claire, who had been working at the orphanage for only a few years. Claire was polite, but her answers were guarded, offering little more than the usual platitudes about the children and the importance of the orphanage's work. Jane pressed her gently, asking about the adoptions, but Claire's responses remained vague. Most of the adoptions were handled by Mr. Roberts directly, Claire explained, her gaze flicking nervously around the room. He was very involved in the process, always ensuring that the children went to good homes. And after the adoptions? Jane asked, leaning forward slightly. Did you ever hear from the children again? Any follow-up visits or correspondence? Claire hesitated, her fingers twisting in her lap. Not really. Mr. Roberts always said that it was important for the children to have a fresh start, to be able to move on with their new families without any ties to the past. Jane nodded, but her mind was already working through the implications. A fresh start. Was that how Mr. Roberts had justified their disappearances? She thanked Claire for her time and moved on to the next staff member. The pattern continued with each interview. The staff members, though polite and cooperative on the surface, all seemed to share the same unease, the same reluctance to discuss the adoptions in any detail. It was as if they had been coached on what to say, carefully avoiding any mention of the children's fates after they left the orphanage. Jane's frustration grew with each interview. She could sense that there was more beneath the surface, but no one was willing to break the carefully maintained facade. The staff were like actors in a play, each reciting their lines with precision, but Jane could see the cracks forming. Her final interview of the day was with a man named George, one of the oldest staff members at the orphanage. He had been there for decades, long before Mr. Roberts became involved. George was gruff and somewhat withdrawn, his eyes wary as he spoke. Mr. Roberts was a good man, George said, his voice rough from years of smoking. He did a lot for this place, but things changed after he started taking an interest in the adoptions. Jane's ears perked up at this. What do you mean by that? George shrugged, his gaze sliding away from hers. I don't know. It's just things got more secretive. We weren't allowed to ask questions, and those kids, well, they just disappeared, didn't they? Jane felt a chill run down her spine. George's words confirmed what she had already suspected. There was something deeply wrong with what had happened to those children, and Mr. Roberts had been at the center of it. As she left the orphanage, Jane knew that she was only scratching the surface of a much larger and darker truth. The staff might be evasive, but their guarded responses had only strengthened her resolve. Whatever Mr. Roberts had been hiding, she was determined to uncover it, even if it meant confronting the shadows that lurked behind the orphanage's walls. The mansion was eerily quiet as Jane stepped inside, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows through the tall windows. The day's events weighed heavily on her mind, and she could feel a growing sense of urgency. Something was terribly wrong, and she knew that the answers she sought might be found within these walls. Jane had spent the past few days familiarizing herself with the layout of the mansion, but there were still parts of it that remained unexplored. The idea that Mr. Roberts might have hidden something within the very place where he had lived and worked was not far-fetched, especially given the secrets she had already uncovered. And so, with a renewed sense of purpose, she began to search more thoroughly. She started with the study, where she had found the notebook earlier. Carefully, she examined the walls, the shelves, and the furniture, looking for anything out of place. Hours passed, and just as she was beginning to feel frustrated, her fingers brushed against a section of the bookcase that felt different from the rest. The wood was slightly warmer, and the surface smoother, as if it had been handled frequently. With a careful push, the section of the bookcase swung inward with a soft click, revealing a narrow staircase that led downward. Jane's heart raced as she descended the steps, each creak of the old wood echoing ominously in the confined space. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a small, windowless room. The air was thick and stale, and the walls were lined with metal shelves. On those shelves were dozens of files, each one marked with a name. Jane's breath caught as she recognized the names from her research, the names of the children who had vanished after being adopted by Mr. Roberts. She pulled out one of the files, her hands trembling as she opened it. Inside were detailed records, medical reports, psychological evaluations, and notes written in a precise, clinical hand. As she flipped through the pages, a sickening realization began to take hold. These children had been subjects of some kind of experiment. The reports were filled with references to tests and procedures, all signed off by Mr. Roberts himself. Jane felt a wave of nausea. The philanthropist who had been lauded for his generosity and kindness was nothing more than a monster, conducting horrific experiments on innocent children under the guise of adoption. The hidden room was a mausoleum of his sins, and Jane had just opened the door to the full extent of his depravity. As she continued to sift through the files, she found more evidence, photographs of the children, taken during and after the experiments, showing the physical and emotional toll they had endured. Some of the photos were too disturbing to look at for long, but Jane forced herself to go on. She needed to understand the full scope of what had happened here. In one of the final files, she found a document that mentioned the heir in connection with the experiments. The text was cryptic, but it suggested that the heir was somehow involved or affected by these horrific acts. Jane's mind reeled as she tried to connect the dots. Could the heir be one of the children who had been subjected to these experiments? Or was the heir the intended result of Mr. Roberts's twisted research? Jane's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise from above, the sound of a door creaking open. Her heart leaped into her throat. Someone else was in the mansion. She quickly gathered the files she could carry, tucking them into her bag, and made her way back up the stairs. She paused at the top, listening intently. The mansion was silent once more, but Jane knew better than to trust that silence. She carefully pushed the bookcase back into place, concealing the hidden room, and then hurried out of the study. She had found the evidence she needed, but she was no longer alone in the mansion. The stakes had just been raised, and Jane knew that she had to get out of there before it was too late. Jane's heart pounded as she slipped out of the study and into the dimly lit hallway. The mansion, once merely oppressive, now felt like a labyrinth of danger, with every shadow concealing a potential threat. She needed to leave to get the files she had found to safety. But first, she had to ensure she wasn't being followed. She moved quickly but quietly, taking a circuitous route through the mansion's many rooms, her senses on high alert for any sign of movement. As she passed through the grand foyer, she caught sight of a figure moving near the front door. Jane froze, ducking behind a heavy velvet curtain that partially concealed her from view. From her hiding spot, she saw Mrs. Whelan, the orphanage director, standing in the doorway. The director's normally composed demeanor was gone, replaced by an expression of cold determination. She was speaking in low tones to someone just out of Jane's line of sight, but Jane didn't need to hear the words to understand the gravity of the situation. Mrs. Whelan was here to retrieve something she couldn't allow Jane to take. The conversation ended abruptly, and Mrs. Whelan turned, her eyes scanning the room as if sensing Jane's presence. Jane held her breath, willing herself to remain perfectly still. After a tense moment, Mrs. Whelan moved away from the door, heading deeper into the mansion. The moment she was out of sight, Jane slipped out from behind the curtain and made a dash for the side exit she had spotted earlier. The door creaked as she pushed it open, but Jane didn't stop. She darted out into the cold evening air, the weight of the files in her bag a constant reminder of the danger she was in. She reached her car and fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking with adrenaline. As soon as the engine roared to life, she sped away from the mansion, glancing nervously in the rearview mirror for any signs of pursuit. It wasn't until she was halfway back to her hotel that she allowed herself to breathe. The realization of what she had just uncovered and the narrow escape she had just made began to sink in. The truth was far darker than she had imagined, and now she had the evidence to prove it. But with that evidence came new dangers. Mrs. Whelan and whoever she was working with wouldn't just let Jane walk away with these files. When she finally reached her hotel room, Jane locked the door behind her and collapsed onto the bed, her mind racing. The files were spread out before her, a stark reminder of the horrors she had uncovered. She knew she needed to contact someone who could help her bring this to light. But who could she trust? The phone rang, startling Jane out of her thoughts. She stared at it for a moment before picking it up, her voice trembling slightly as she answered. "Miss Donovan." The voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. "I believe you found something that doesn't belong to you." Jane's blood ran cold. It was Mrs. Whelan. "Whatever you think you know, you're in over your head," Mrs. Whelan continued, her tone measured but with an unmistakable edge of menace. "Return the files, and we can forget this ever happened." Jane's mind raced as she tried to think of a response. She couldn't let them intimidate her, not after everything she had discovered, but she also knew that she was in real danger. Her voice steadied as she replied, "I'm not going to let this go. The truth will come out, and you won't be able to stop it." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a soft chuckle. "You're making a mistake, Miss Donovan. But if you insist on playing this game, just know that there are consequences." The line went dead, leaving Jane staring at the phone in her hand. She knew she had just crossed a line, and there would be no turning back. The confrontation with Mrs. Whelan had only confirmed what she already suspected. There were powerful people who would go to great lengths to keep the truth hidden. But Jane wasn't about to back down. She had the files, she had the evidence, and now she had a new resolve. She would expose the truth, no matter the cost. The next morning, Jane awoke to the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. For a brief moment, she forgot where she was, her mind still foggy from the events of the previous day. But as she reached for the phone and saw the string of missed calls and messages, the gravity of her situation came rushing back. She sat up, rubbing her eyes as she scrolled through the messages. Most were from unknown numbers, likely attempts by Mrs. Whelan or her associates to intimidate her into giving up the files. But one message stood out, a simple, cryptic text from a blocked number. "Meet me at the old train station. Noon. I can help you." Jane's heart skipped a beat. The old train station was a derelict building on the outskirts of town, long abandoned and mostly forgotten. It was the perfect place for a clandestine meeting, but it was also a potential trap. She hesitated, weighing her options. Whoever had sent the message claimed they could help, but could she really trust them? She thought about the files, the horrific experiments, and the children who had been victimized. The truth was too important to ignore, and if this lead could provide her with more information, it was worth the risk. With a deep breath, Jane decided to go. The drive to the train station was tense, the winter sky overcast and threatening snow. The closer she got, the more desolate the landscape became, with bare trees lining the road like silent sentinels. When she finally arrived, she parked her car out of sight and approached the crumbling building with caution. The station was a relic of the past, its once grand facade now chipped and weathered by time. The windows were broken, and the platform, where passengers had once eagerly awaited their trains, was now overgrown with weeds. Jane scanned the area, her senses on high alert, before cautiously stepping inside. The interior was just as decrepit as the exterior, with debris scattered across the floor and the remnants of old benches lining the walls. A faint draft whispered through the broken windows, carrying with it the scent of decay. Jane's footsteps echoed in the empty space as she moved deeper into the station, searching for any sign of the person who had sent the message. "Miss Donovan?" The voice came from behind her, low and gravelly. Jane spun around to see a figure emerge from the shadows, a man in his late 40s, with greying hair and a weathered face. He wore a long coat, the collar turned up against the cold, and his eyes were sharp, appraising her with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Who are you?" Jane asked, her voice steady despite the tension coiling in her chest. The man hesitated, glancing around as if to ensure they were alone. "My name isn't important. What matters is that I worked with Mr. Roberts for many years. I know what he was doing, and I want to help you stop it." Jane narrowed her eyes, trying to gauge his sincerity. "Why should I trust you?" "Because I don't want to see anyone else hurt," he replied, his voice tinged with regret. "I was part of it, but I didn't know the full extent of what was happening until it was too late. By the time I realized, I was already in too deep. But you have a chance to expose the truth." Jane considered his words, her instincts telling her that he was being honest. There was something in his eyes, a mix of guilt and determination, that convinced her he was telling the truth. "What do you know about the secret heir?" she asked, lowering her voice. The man sighed, running a hand through his greying hair. "The heir, it's not what you think. The children, they were supposed to be experiments. But one of them was special. Mr. Roberts believed this child held the key to something greater, something that could change everything. But it was all based on a twisted theory, and the cost was too high." Jane felt a chill run down her spine. "Who is the heir? Where can I find them?" The man shook his head. "I don't know. The records were destroyed, and the child was moved before everything collapsed. But there's one person who might know. One of the staff at the orphanage. They were close to Mr. Roberts, and they were the last to see the child." "Who?" Jane pressed. He hesitated, then finally whispered the name, "Sister Agnes. She's been hiding in plain sight, working at the orphanage. But she knows more than she lets on." Jane nodded, her mind racing with this new information. "Thank you," she said, her voice earnest. "This could be the break I need." The man nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Be careful, Miss Donovan. You're in deeper than you know." As Jane turned to leave, she couldn't help but wonder what else this man knew, and whether she would ever uncover the full truth. But for now, she had a new lead, and time was running out. Jane's heart was pounding as she pulled up to the orphanage later that afternoon, the weight of the files still heavy in her bag. The sky had darkened with thick grey clouds, and a light snow had begun to fall, dusting the ground in a thin, white layer. The air was crisp, biting at her cheeks as she stepped out of the car and made her way toward the entrance. She had to find Sister Agnes, and she had to do it quickly. The information from the mysterious man at the train station had left her with more questions than answers, but it had also given her a glimmer of hope. If Sister Agnes knew where the heir was, then Jane might finally be able to piece together the puzzle. As she approached the door, she noticed something that made her pause. A car, parked at an odd angle near the side of the building. The driver's side door was slightly ajar, and there were footprints in the snow leading away from it. A sense of unease settled over her, but she pushed forward, her determination outweighing her fear. Inside, the orphanage was quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of children playing and staff moving about were absent, replaced by an unsettling silence that pressed in on her from all sides. Jane's footsteps echoed softly on the tiled floor as she made her way down the hallway, her eyes scanning for any sign of Sister Agnes. She turned a corner and nearly collided with a young woman in a staff uniform. The woman's eyes widened in surprise, but before she could say anything, Jane spoke. "I'm looking for Sister Agnes. It's urgent." The woman hesitated, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "She's in the chapel," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "But something's not right. Be careful." Jane's pulse quickened as she nodded and continued down the hallway. The chapel was located at the far end of the building, a small, dimly lit room that was often used for quiet reflection. As she approached the door, she noticed that it was slightly ajar, and from inside she could hear the faint murmur of voices. She pushed the door open slowly, her breath catching in her throat as she took in the scene. Sister Agnes was kneeling in front of the altar, her hands clasped in prayer. Standing behind her with an expression of cold resolve was Mrs. Whelan. "Miss Donovan," Mrs. Whelan said without turning around, her voice calm and controlled. "I was wondering when you'd arrive." Jane's eyes darted between the two women, her mind racing. Sister Agnes seemed oblivious to her presence, her focus entirely on her prayers, while Mrs. Whelan's stance was anything but benign. "What are you doing here?" Jane asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. Mrs. Whelan finally turned to face her, a faint smile playing on her lips. "I'm tying up loose ends. It's unfortunate, really. You were so close to uncovering the truth, but I'm afraid this is where your journey ends." Jane's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the danger she was in. Mrs. Whelan had known she was coming, and now she was cornered. She glanced at Sister Agnes, who still hadn't moved, and then back at Mrs. Whelan, trying to think of a way out. "Leave her out of this," Jane said, her voice firm. "She's not involved." Mrs. Whelan's smile widened slightly. "On the contrary, Miss Donovan, she's very much involved. She's the last piece of the puzzle, and once I've dealt with her, there will be no one left to uncover the truth." Before Jane could react, Mrs. Whelan reached into her coat and pulled out a small, black object. Jane's blood ran cold as she realized it was a syringe filled with a clear liquid. "I'm afraid I can't let you leave," Mrs. Whelan said, her tone almost regretful. "This is the end of the road for you." Jane's mind raced as she searched for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped, and Mrs. Whelan was closing in. The room seemed to shrink around her as the reality of the situation set in, but just as Mrs. Whelan took a step forward, a loud crash echoed from the hallway, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. Mrs. Whelan froze, her eyes narrowing as she turned toward the door. The momentary distraction was all Jane needed. She lunged forward, grabbing Sister Agnes by the arm and pulling her to her feet. "Run!" Jane shouted, her voice breaking the tense silence. Sister Agnes snapped out of her trance, and the two women bolted for the door, Mrs. Whelan's shout of anger echoing behind them. They raced down the hallway, their footsteps pounding in unison as they fled the chapel. Jane's heart raced as they rounded a corner and burst through an emergency exit, the cold air hitting them like a wall. They didn't stop, running as fast as they could toward Jane's car. As they reached it, Jane fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking, but she managed to unlock the doors. They both jumped inside, and Jane started the engine, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. She glanced at Sister Agnes, who was breathing heavily, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to get out of here," Jane said, her voice trembling as she floored the accelerator, the car lurching forward onto the snowy road. As they sped away from the orphanage, Jane's mind raced with questions. Who had caused the distraction? And what had Mrs. Whelan meant when she said Sister Agnes was the last piece of the puzzle? But one thing was clear: this was far from over. The truth was still out there, and Jane was more determined than ever to uncover it. Click on the video on your screen or on the description to continue.